What does it mean to identify as gay? While the question might seem straightforward, it's likely that many of you felt an immediate urge to click away just from hearing it. If you're a secular progressive or a member of the LGBT community, you might wonder why this question even needs to be asked in a time when so many have finally found the courage to live openly after centuries of stigma. You may feel guarded, concerned that raising this topic could signal an attempt to resurrect outdated cultural debates that threaten to erase your identity, deny your lived reality, or pressure you to hide who you are. On the other hand, if you come from a conservative religious background, you may feel an anxious worry that this conversation could challenge the core beliefs that shape your faith and values. No matter where you find yourself, the truth is that this topic touches on something profoundly sensitive. So, why engage with this conversation at all? What makes it so relevant? The answer is revealed, in part, by the existence of a third group watching, one overlooked, and sometimes painfully invisible, not just to the world, but even to those closest to them. These are individuals who experience same-sex attraction, but find themselves caught in an excruciating internal tug-of-war, either because they are religious themselves, or because they grew up in a strongly religious culture, causing them to remain closeted indefinitely and unsure about how they should process the fact that they're attracted to the same sex. For them, the question of sexual identity isn't a relic of cultural debates from the past, but something deeply personal and very much present. They may feel unheard by both secular and religious communities, unsure how, or if, they can ever openly be themselves, expressing the full spectrum of their values and experiences without judgment. Why might they feel such strong pressure to remain closeted? Not too long ago, I published a video criticizing the purity culture movement of the 1990s and 2000s. I mentioned that, despite the well-meaning intentions of purity culture, the way the movement implemented its principles ultimately caused more harm than good, often fostering shame, secrecy, and repression, rather than integration, authentic self-mastery, and virtue. While most religious communities, to their credit, have made concerted attempts to move beyond the errors of purity culture, new cultural perspectives analogous to purity culture continue to influence religious perspectives, this time on the topic of same-sex attraction. These perspectives are often so entrenched in popular discourse that even well-educated religious individuals have trouble distinguishing them from the actual teachings of the faith they hold. While the intention of such perspectives may be to promote traditional positions on sexual ethics, the way that such perspectives are being interpreted, communicated, or enforced has created an environment that often causes more harm than good and distorts the meaning of the teachings that they try to defend. Before I identify the nature of the culture impacting religious discourse on same-sex attraction, I want to make one thing clear. This video is not an attempt to negate traditional perspectives on sexual ethics or the religious beliefs that often correlate with them. Neither is this video an attempt to proselytize or promote such perspectives. As I mentioned in my previous video on the topic of lust, I understand that my viewers have a large diversity of opinions about sex, and I value all of my viewers, regardless of their perspectives. As per the norm on my channel, this discussion will be a reflection for a universal audience on the topic of moral philosophy, namely on what it means to live well and how to integrate difficult parts of ourselves with integrity. I understand that perspectives on this issue are deeply personal and sincerely held. Thus, my aim is to engage both religious and secular views in good faith, with respect for difference and a genuine desire to build mutual understanding. I also aim to provide something of value for everyone. Even if this topic doesn't speak directly to your personal experience, I hope it will help you to refine your own perspectives on ethics and engage better with those who hold opposing perspectives. So with that said, let's examine why the concept of gay identity has become such a cultural flashpoint, especially in religious spaces. As recently as the late 2000s, most Western cultures were still debating in public spaces whether homosexual orientation is a choice. While the vast majority of people, even religious conservatives, arrived at the conclusion by the late 2010s that homosexual orientation is generally not chosen, lingering questions remained for those in conservative circles about how those who experience homosexual orientation through no choice of their own ought to interact with their sexual inclinations. A common argument in conservative circles went something like this. Even if one doesn't choose to be attracted to the same sex, one does choose what to identify as. Therefore, if same-sex behavior violates traditional sexual ethics, why would someone striving for virtue actively identify with an inclination towards such behavior? After all, if same-sex attracted individuals publicly express a desire to live chastely, wouldn't it introduce unnecessary confusion to publicly identify with one's sexual inclinations, since sex isn't relevant to their public identity? From this perspective, public identification with one's orientation risks warping our understanding of human nature by reducing the self to one's desires, elevating sexual feelings to the level of personal essence. Religious influencers like Trent Horn argued that terms like gay Christian send the wrong message by reinforcing the idea that homosexuality is central to one's identity, and therefore something that should be affirmed. For such critics, objections like, "I don't want to hide my identity," reflect a misplaced emphasis, putting one's gay identity ahead of one's truest identity, that of being a beloved child of God, created in His image. Same-sex attraction, they argue, is not an identity, but an experience, one that should never be embraced as a defining feature of the self, since the experience runs contrary to objective human ontology. It is no more coherent, in their view, to identify as gay as it is to introduce oneself by mentioning one's struggle with a vice. The intent behind these ideas is to provide instruction for religious gay people on how to live lives coherent with what they believe, very similar to how the intent behind purity culture was to empower Christians to live in accord with the virtue of chastity more generally. But, just as purity culture fell short of its goal because it embraced certain errors, so too does this cultural framework introduce ideas extraneous to the religious beliefs it tries to promote that ultimately cause more harm than good. For many gay individuals who grow up hearing these ideas, the effects can be quietly devastating. If identifying as gay is consistently framed as inappropriate, suspect, or even sinful, notably even for individuals who decide to publicly embrace abstinence, then the quiet implication seems to be that it's impossible for same-sex attracted individuals to integrate their sexual drive into their overall being because their sex drive is fundamentally problematic in a way that they can't ever change. To embrace their sexuality, so they're told, is to identify with sin. So, if they can't ever change their sexuality, the only thing they can realistically do if they wish to be virtuous is repress it. Repression, as I mentioned in my video on purity culture, is devastating to the human psyche and is ultimately doomed to fail. So, if embracing one's sexuality is supposedly sinful, but repressing it is a recipe for a deeply wounded psyche, what is a religious same-sex attracted individual to do if they wish to avoid developing psychological pathologies? One common remedy proposed by individuals in conservative religious spheres is to integrate sexuality in the ontologically correct sense, i.e., ignoring same-sex inclinations entirely, to channel sexuality in a more metaphysical, spiritual sense, i.e., loving others in a way that begets positive fruits in the world. Such a remedy, to be fair, is one proposed by many traditions, both religious and non-religious, for all individuals practicing celibacy, regardless of sexual orientation. Catholic clergy, for example, generally incorporates an analogous principle into their spirituality. The dilemma for many gay individuals, however, is that such cultures often claim, notably even when their underlying principles don't require them to, that gay individuals can't properly engage in spiritual fatherhood or motherhood because they can't understand fecundity, fruitfulness, properly, even in the more metaphysical sense, absent an attraction between masculinity and femininity. Or, conversely, such cultures will sometimes claim that if an individual is capable of bearing good fruit spiritually, then there's no reason why they shouldn't be able to do so physically, despite same-sex attraction, since attraction is purportedly only incidental to one's ability to love. Such perspectives, though not necessarily mainstream, are nevertheless made by influential minorities in the religious influencer space, heavily shaping the views of religious communities that explicitly identify as conservative or traditionalist. For gay individuals who hear such perspectives, it can feel like a subtly veiled resurrection of arguments promoting the destructive practice of conversion therapy, albeit with a few amendments. If you don't want to be lonely or struggle with your identity, why not just act straight until your homosexual inclinations don't feel so pressing anymore? After all, if homosexuality is a vice, why not just imitate the corresponding virtue until you acquire that virtue? Thus, many gay individuals internalize the belief that their sexuality is something inherently corrosive. They are told that integration is necessary for healthy sexuality, yet they're also told that to identify with a non-heterosexual orientation is a sin. They are told that fecundity, either physical or spiritual, is an obligation for virtuous individuals, but they are also told that they are either precluded from this due to their attractions, or that they have an obligation to overcome their attractions to become as though they were straight, even if deep inside they still remain same-sex attracted. Consequently, many end up struggling with severe emotional and psychological distress because they see no other alternative than repression. This emotional and psychological distress is often compounded by another consequence of these frameworks: the isolation they create. Because gay identity is so often framed as an inappropriate label that reduces a person to their sexual inclinations, many religious individuals who are same-sex attracted feel they have no vocabulary to describe their interior life without immediately being viewed as morally compromised. Even the simple act of naming their experience can be seen as a threat. To say, "I'm gay," is interpreted not as a statement of fact about one's orientation, but as an ideological claim, or a sign of rebellion, or a confession of engaging in sinful activity. As a result, many feel they can't talk about their experience at all. They can't reach out to others for encouragement or solidarity, because any attempt to name what they're going through is seen as an act of self-reduction or moral corruption. This is especially problematic because many in these cultures encourage same-sex individuals to find intimacy through non-romantic outlets. While the recommendation to embrace non-romantic intimacy is one I can actually agree with, not just for same-sex attracted individuals, but for everyone. See my recent video on how intimacy isn't always romantic. The difficulty lies in the fact that such intimacy can never be realized under such circumstances if intimacy is understood as into me see. How can one truly ever experience authentic intimacy if the truths of their inner life must always remain hidden from others? While some do, to their credit, encourage gay people to open up about their experiences, gay individuals are often counseled to restrict such openness to straight individuals they share disinterested friendships with. Such restrictions are intended to protect people from temptation, but the effect is that gay individuals are isolated from those who can relate to their experiences. Some conservatives may respond by stating that they don't restrict people from discussing their experience of same-sex attractions, but merely advise people not to turn that experience into an identity. Many gay individuals would respond, however, that it is ironically the conservative framing of gayness as an identity that is unnecessarily reductive and fixated on sex. Gay identity, they argue, is not reducible to who someone is attracted to, but rather encompasses the broader implications of what living with those attractions means for them and their life at large. When conservatives ask what those implications might be, gay individuals respond that the inability to name and identify such implications is part of the problem, and that attempts to restrict gay identity prevent people from being aware of what gay individuals go through, leaving gay individuals to figure out how to cope alone. This is one reason why many same-sex attracted individuals resonate with the broader language of queerness. While the term sometimes makes people across the political spectrum feel uncomfortable, and while it has taken on a large variety of meanings throughout the ages, some notably less constructive than others, in this context, it names a broader existential condition: the feeling of being other in ways that are difficult to articulate, of navigating a world that isn't built to recognize or support one's emotional life. The experience of queerness often encompasses the pressure to pass, to blend in, to remain silent, to hide anything that doesn't fit cleanly into heteronormative expectations. Queerness means many things. Quietly struggling for years, if not decades, with the conviction you have to lie to the people that you love. Worrying that you might lose the people closest to you if they find out what you hide from them. That the large majority of people around you fundamentally aren't like you and may never understand you. That you will never truly belong, and that at best you can only ever hope to fit in by mastering social scripts that remove any suspicion that you are different. For many gay individuals, assertions that one can't publicly identify as gay are tantamount to stating that one can't publicly discuss their experience of queerness. And for many of these same individuals, a not insignificant number of whom are religious individuals who genuinely wish to strive for chastity in accord with their religious beliefs, the isolation caused by being prevented, either socially or through internalized shame, from talking about their experience of queerness is far more painful than any kind of loneliness caused by being celibate could ever be. Psychological research supports this pain. A growing body of evidence has shown that the consequence of hiding one's sexual orientation, sometimes called concealment stress, is strongly associated with higher risks of anxiety, depression, and reduced well-being. One study published in NIH's PubMed found that the mental and even physical health risks tied to concealment can be as serious as those faced by people undergoing overt discrimination. In short, the closet isn't a place of moral protection. It's a place of quiet, consuming harm. What makes this reality so tragic is that many of the people who are suffering in the closet aren't bitter, rebellious, or hostile to faith. Quite the opposite. They're trying their hardest to be faithful, to love God and neighbor, and to walk the path of integrity in accord with traditional convictions. But despite their intentions, they've been harmed by the presentation of a false choice, either silence or sinfulness, when nowhere in the faith they subscribe to is such a dichotomy imposed upon them. Here, I anticipate that many conservatives will respond that truth, either philosophical or religious in nature, does in fact require those pursuing virtue to eschew a gay identity. While many may sympathize with the suffering that gay individuals experience as a consequence of their feeling of otherness, they'll assert that remedies for pain must always be rooted in an objective understanding of human nature, since anything contrary to truth will fundamentally be contrary to flourishing. It is the prerogative of any human being who wishes to be happy to conform their lives to what is metaphysically and morally true. If homosexuality is indeed objectively disordered in its teleology, that is, if it inclines one towards actions that are intrinsically misaligned with human flourishing, then the emotional consequences of living in accord with that truth, while lamentable, are not evidence against said truth, Rather, such consequences are the cross one must bear, a cross that one might even celebrate as morally heroic. The answer then is not to affirm a gay identity or normalize queerness, but to offer pastoral support that encourages mortification of one's passions, and ultimately the eventual achievement of moral perfection through continual sanctification. To do otherwise, they argue, is to sacrifice truth on the altar of comfort. Given that I share many philosophical convictions with those who make this argument, I subscribe to natural law and virtue ethics, and I believe that human flourishing can only be achieved when one lives in accordance with objective truth, I must admit that I sympathize with the general sentiment. However, general principles aside, it is necessary to recognize that the logical soundness of the argument as a whole rests upon the truth value of one of its core premises, namely that identifying as gay is an act contrary to metaphysical truth. So, in the interest of pursuing truth, which is the ultimate goal of philosophy, let's examine that premise. To begin, let's return to the fundamental question of what it means to identify as gay. Many critics of gay identity speak as though the term is synonymous with moral approval of same-sex acts, or an admission that one is engaging in such acts or intends to. They call for use of the phrase same-sex attracted because they assert that it eliminates ambiguity. While I certainly sympathize with calls for clearer, less ambiguous language in public discourse, whether for this topic or any other, it's important to remember that charity demands we understand language in the sense that those using it intend their words to be understood. As mentioned in my video on the art of disagreeing respectfully, public discourse should serve a formative purpose, engaging both sides in a shared pursuit of understanding and truth. If we do not address people's positions in the way they actually mean to convey them, then we are merely talking past each other while never truly responding to each other's concerns. What then do those who generally use the term gay to describe themselves mean to communicate? Ironically, in the vast majority of cases, the word gay is merely synonymous with same-sex attracted, conveying in essence the same thing, the experience of being attracted to the same sex. Arguments about terms, then, appear largely moot in this case. What about the term gay turning same-sex attraction into an identity rather than merely communicating an experience? Most conservative critics assert, after all, that identifying as gay puts the gay identity before one's fundamental identity as a child of God. In response to this assertion, I would like to just ask one question. Why does the act of adopting an identity automatically mean that that identity is placed before or above other identities? It is normal and virtually universally accepted practice for everyone to adopt a wide range of identities besides being a child of God. People identify with their nationality, their ethnicity, their race, their language, their local culture, their political affiliation, their sex, their ability or disability status, their career, their hobbies and passions. And that's just a small sampling. There are generally only two possibilities that could warrant the assertion that any of those identities is being placed above one's fundamental core identity. The first is that the identity is being held up as an idol that becomes all-encompassing, as would be the case of someone who, for example, becomes such a devout nationalist that they hold the success of their nation to be the single most important thing their life is directed towards, subverting and reordering all other identities toward that goal. While it's theoretically the case that this might happen in the case of sexuality, it would be inaccurate to assert that this happens de facto every time someone identifies as gay, since most of the time people are merely acknowledging their same-sex attractions. Likewise, it would be uncharitable to suggest that people who identify as gay actively desire to idolize their sexuality, as that would read more into one's intentions than what their actions reasonably warrant. The second possibility is that the identity in question is fundamentally contrary to one's more foundational identity, such that one cannot adopt the contrary identity without rejecting their foundational one. Having analyzed the logical structure of this argument, it is my belief that this is the hidden premise the argument necessarily would rely on to be sound. that the gay identity is fundamentally at odds with one's foundational identity, whether as a child of God or simply as a human being governed by natural law. That naturally begs the question, is gay identity contrary to one's foundational identity? Before I touch upon that question, I want to offer a brief but important disclaimer. I will not, in this section, attempt to advocate for one answer over another. I recognize that my viewers, reflecting society at large, will have very divergent opinions on this matter, and I similarly understand that the conclusions drawn can have deeply personal implications. It's likely many of you are wondering why these questions are even worth exploring, especially if you worry exploring such a topic gives a platform to potentially troublesome ideas or cast doubt upon what one might hope should be a common consensus. I understand the sentiment, and I also understand the risks associated with having this discussion. However, the very fact that such stark disagreement exists over this question demonstrates why such discussions like these remain important to have. Minds are rarely changed without good faith engagement, and such engagement cannot occur unless we properly understand the views of both ourselves and our opposition. With that in mind, please know that my goal is not to provoke or pass judgment, but simply to explore the arguments of both sides in good faith. Even if you don't ultimately agree with the conclusions of one side or the other, I would still encourage you to engage with the material. If not to understand the internal logic of the other side better, then at least to refine your own. With that in mind, the question can be addressed two ways, religiously or philosophically. Since my channel is primarily focused on philosophy, I'll be concentrating most of my attention on the philosophical dimension. But because this conversation so often intersects with religious frameworks, and because many of the people wrestling with these questions do so in faith-based context, I want to take a moment to briefly consider the religious argument as well. While I won't attempt to speak for every religious tradition, I'd like to examine one that has deliberately attempted to approach this topic with nuance: Catholicism. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, quote, "The number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible," end quote. While the Church does teach that these inclinations are not ordered towards the procreative purpose of sex, and thus fall outside the full vision of human sexuality it holds, the Catechism also makes clear that individuals who experience homosexual inclinations are fully capable of pursuing Christian virtue and holiness. It affirms that, quote, "Homosexual persons, by the virtues of self-mastery that teach them inner freedom, can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection," end quote. Further asserting that, quote, "These persons are called, if they are Christians, to unite to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross the difficulties they may experience from their condition," end quote. In other words, the Church does not present the experience of homosexuality as something that disqualifies a person from God's grace or friendship. On the contrary, it emphasizes that same-sex attracted individuals, even while remaining same-sex attracted, can grow in sanctity, exercise heroic virtue, and fully participate in the redemptive journey of the Christian life by living in accord with the universal virtues all humans are equally called to exhibit. The challenging life experiences surrounding same-sex attraction, far from being an obstacle to holiness, can become a unique and powerful path to it. If the Catechism makes that much clear, why is there continued disagreement? On the one side, theological conservatives may respond that the Catechism merely addresses the phenomenon of experiencing same-sex attraction, which is distinct from identifying with it. They may reference a 1987 document from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith that states, quote, "The human person made in the image and likeness of God can hardly be adequately described by a reductionist reference to his or her sexual orientation. The Church refuses to consider the person solely as a heterosexual or a homosexual, and insists that every person has a fundamental identity, the creature of God, and by grace, his child and heir to eternal life," end quote. Critics of such a perspective will respond by stating that, while at first glance this passage may seem to support the argument against adopting a gay identity, a closer look suggests a more nuanced intention. The document's concern, they'll suggest, lies not with acknowledging orientation per se, but in guarding against the idea that one's sexual orientation alone is sufficient to understand a person's moral or anthropological meaning. It doesn't argue that referencing one's orientation is inherently problematic. In fact, both the document itself and the Catechism regularly use the phrase homosexual persons, which arguably acts as a descriptor of identity. The deeper concern, rather, is that no single aspect of a person, whether their desires, talents, limitations, or relationships, should be seen as exhaustively defining who they are. In other words, it warns against turning any non-foundational identity, no matter what it is, into an idol, akin to the example of the hypothetical nationalist I mentioned earlier in the video. Therefore, critics will argue, if identifying as gay in the mere sense of acknowledging same-sex attractions does not de facto make that identity an idol, there seems to be no fundamental incompatibility between a gay identity thusly expressed and one's foundational identity as a beloved child of God. What about the philosophical dimension? Most arguments addressing the topic of gay identity come from the natural law tradition. As a quick aside, natural law is not always well understood in our day and age, even by proponents of the theory. Consequently, I believe it may be helpful to offer a brief overview of the tradition generally, before diving into the specific arguments certain natural law proponents make. Natural law is sometimes spoken of as if it were a fixed list of unquestionable moral rules. In reality, however, natural law is much like science, in that, while it makes assertions about objective reality, it also recognizes that the exact nature of that reality is open to interpretation, development, and even internal debate. As such, even within the natural law tradition, perspectives on ethics can sometimes diverge. What exactly is natural law then? To understand natural law, it helps to begin with a closely related tradition, virtue ethics, especially as formulated by Aristotle. As I mentioned in my Living the Good Life video, Aristotle argues in his Nicomacheaen ethics that true human flourishing, what he calls eudaimonia, is achieved when one flourishes by acting in accord with nature. The goal of ethics, according to Aristotle and virtue ethics more broadly, is to develop good character that is conducive to thriving because it fosters constructive habits of the will, virtues, while eschewing destructive habits, vices. What objective foundation determines what constitutes a virtue or a vice? Ultimately, according to Aristotle, human nature is that objective foundation. It is here that natural law offers to further develop virtue ethics. At its heart, natural law theory rests on the conviction that there is a rational moral order built into human nature that is discernible through reason. In its traditional form, particularly as articulated by the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas, this theory is teleological. It sees all things, including human actions, as directed towards ends or goods. For Aristotle, the proper end of human beings, our telos, is a life lived in accordance with reason. Actions that conform to reason promote human flourishing, while those that don't undermine it. What kind of actions conform to reason? In brief, actions conform to reason when they incline us towards certain fundamental goods that our nature naturally prompts us to pursue. Likewise, our actions are rational when we properly distinguish between true and apparent goods, i.e., goods that are actually consistent with nature, and goods that might appear to benefit us but actually are detrimental to our thriving. Conversely, actions that frustrate or block our pursuit of those goods, especially when we're naturally ordered toward them, are considered contrary to reason. While natural law philosophers may disagree about what fundamental goods humans are naturally oriented towards, most will agree with the general premise that human action ought to be oriented toward those goods. The natural law framework has not gone unchallenged. Critics, most famously the skeptic philosopher David Hume, have argued that one cannot derive an ought from an is. That is, no set of descriptive claims about human nature can, on their own, justify normative conclusions about how one should act. This objection has become a common refrain in modern moral philosophy, casting suspicion on any attempt to ground ethics in metaphysics. For this reason, it is not uncommon for contemporary philosophers to dismiss natural law theory entirely. However, as I mentioned in a short essay I posted to my Twitter, the legitimacy of Hume's argument rests entirely on what he means by ought. Most contemporary philosophers agree that traditional expressions of natural law theory typically ground moral obligation in divine law, i.e., the authority of the Creator who instilled intrinsic purposes in all things. Under such a view, natural law only imposes moral obligations because one faces divine judgment for violating the prescriptions of natural law. The philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe gave credence to this line of critique when she famously argued in her essay Modern Moral Philosophy that the language of moral obligation only retains coherence within a framework that affirms the existence of God. Just as the concept of a criminal makes no sense apart from a system of criminal law and courts, the notion of duty remains unintelligible without a divine legislator who commands and forbids. In some respects, I would agree with this critique. If the moral authority of natural law relies upon divine law, then it would seem to logically follow that natural law lacks binding moral force absent the existence of God. However, this critique falls short when natural law is paired, as it typically is in modern discourse, with Aristotelian virtue ethics. As Anscombe herself points out, virtue ethics grounds the ought Hume mentioned not in any external moral demand, but rather on what naturally leads to human flourishing, the concept of eudaimonia I mentioned earlier. We can identify ethical oughts, in other words, by examining which actions would be rational for beings to take who aim towards flourishing, a perspective that overlaps considerably with Aquinas' natural law framework. If one adopts a synthesis of natural law and virtue ethics, therefore, it is possible to bypass Hume's critique, so long as one affirms the existence of objective natures, something that proponents of scientific research ought to do, then one can also affirm that there are certain actions that cause beings to either flourish or face harm in accord with their natures. While there may be no obligation in an external legalistic sense, unless one asserts the existence of God, ethical obligations do still remain inasmuch as every being has a strong imperative to seek fulfillment and avoid harm. In other words, if one were to choose harm not as an illusory good but as an end in itself, such an action would be absurd, insane even, because they would be definitionally acting against any coherent motive. One might even go further, as the philosopher Paul Ricoeur does, by drawing a distinction between ethics and morality. If ethics identifies the actions that a rational creature would take to flourish in accord with his nature, then morality is the social obligation that derives from those ethical principles, aiming to uphold justice and rights within a community dynamic, such that no individual is unjustly deprived of the opportunity to pursue flourishing. It is possible, therefore, to build natural law upon a secular foundation in such a way as to give it moral force both individually and socially. And, for those who do believe in God, this foundation does not preclude the possibility of divine consequences additionally layered upon natural ones. If, then, we affirm that natural law is a coherent framework for both secularists and believers alike, then how might various natural law perspectives arrive at different conclusions concerning human sexuality? After all, while the natural law tradition has historically been associated with conservative views on sexuality, natural law tradition is not a monolith. Even amongst natural law theorists, there are differing interpretations of what constitutes human flourishing, how sexual behavior relates to it, and how to assess questions of identity in light of nature and reason. To explore these nuances more deeply, I want to consider a few influential voices within the modern natural law tradition, including thinkers like John Finnis, J. Budziewski, David Oderberg, and Russell Hittinger. While all of them operate within broadly similar metaphysical assumptions, their emphases, conclusions, and tones vary in ways that are worth noting. Some articulate a more stringent, essentialist reading of nature's demands, while others explore how social, psychological, and existential dimensions complicate simple biological accounts. Russell Hittinger distinguishes between natural law frameworks that root flourishing in what is intrinsic to the nature of things themselves, i.e. the purpose of a biological function, for example, and frameworks that take an agnostic view to teleology, instead rooting flourishing in the pursuit of fundamental goods self-evident to practical reason, such as life. While Hittinger criticizes the latter for claiming to be independent of teleology, when it still implicitly relies upon it, how can you identify fundamental goods without understanding natures? He nevertheless acknowledges that the way these two frameworks approach the same ethical questions can differ. David Oderberg, for example, approaches the question of human sexuality from the first framework, attempting to analyze the nature of sex itself. According to Oderberg, sex is naturally ordered towards both procreation and unity, such that, when sexual acts are properly ordered, unity and procreation mutually reinforce each other as ends, thus becoming inseparable in their fullness. The reason Oderberg believes these two ends are inseparable is that unity exists as an end in service of procreation. A strong bond between parents creates a more stable environment in which to raise their offspring. When people engage in sexual acts that deliberately thwart either of these two ends, the act becomes disordered and causes harm. For example, an act ordered towards procreation but contrary to unity, such as a violent sexual act or adultery, is fundamentally unethical. Likewise, any sexual act that seeks unity but deliberately thwarts procreation, such as homosexual sexual acts, are also contrary to human flourishing. John Finnis, on the other hand, approaches the question of human sexuality from the second framework, arguing that sexual acts must be rationally coherent with the pursuit of fundamental goods. Somewhat controversially, Finnis identifies marriage as a fundamental good, suggesting that any sexual act that ought to be ordered towards the good of marriage, that instead acts contrary to the pursuit of that end, is contrary to natural law. Marriage, according to Finnis, is a naturally ordered institution that aims towards both emotional union and procreative potential. Thus, any sexual act that naturally thwarts either of those two ends is contrary to natural law, in practice leading him to arrive at the same conclusions as Oderberg, but for different reasons. How might someone belonging to the natural law tradition dispute these two perspectives? One notable approach is to appeal to the notion that natural law ought to be written on the human heart. According to the philosopher J. Budziewski, natural law, by the very nature of what it is intrinsically self-evident and immediately intelligible. While explicit knowledge of natural law, i.e. a rational and philosophical understanding, can be absent if people's views of nature become distorted due to faulty rationalization, all humans naturally possess a tacit knowledge of natural law that stirs the conscience, unless they later repress it. Natural law, in other words, should be immediately apparent to someone in a state of nature who has no interaction with society, cultural norms, or philosophical principles. So, by that test, are the observations and conclusions of Oderberg and Finnis intrinsically self-evident and immediately intelligible? Opponents of Oderberg's perspective will likely concede that procreation is a core end associated with sex. After all, there is no other means by which humans can beget new life than sexual procreation, excluding artificial means that still rely on natural sexual biological faculties, such as the production of sperm by the testes and production of eggs by the ovaries. However, the fact that procreation is indisputably an end of sexual activity does not automatically mean that it is a necessary end towards which all sexual activity must be ordered. In my video on the social dimensions of eating, I made the case that eating, while inherently nutritive, transcends being a merely biological act because it has a civilizing social dimension that unites us with others and helps us understand who we are. A perspective notably shared by many conservative and traditional cultures. How might a natural law theorist process that claim? Many natural law theorists argue that nutrition is an essential end of consumption, while social bonding is a secondary end that can be either present or absent depending on the context. Put another way, social bonding is a good that can be pursued through eating to elevate the degree of flourishing caused by the act, but it is not a good that needs to be present, such that one is forfeiting a good that ought to be pursued as an imperative. In accord with this framework, opponents of Oderberg's perspective may argue that procreation is an important end of sexual activity that is indisputably beneficial to human flourishing, but it is not an end that must be present as an imperative when engaging in sexual activity. Defenders of Oderberg would likely argue that, while the existence of secondary beneficial ends may be a reality they're willing to grant, procreation as an end is more akin to nutrition than it is to social bonding, since procreation is the constitutive end without which the act of sex loses coherent meaning as a biological process for survival and flourishing. Opponents, however, might point out that observation of both human and non-human sexual activity seems to demonstrate that sex has important social functions that aren't always associated with procreation, and that engagement in such actions doesn't appear to have any observable negative psychological effects, absent feelings of shame caused by disorder between beliefs and behavior. Such psychological observations, of course, are often disputed by conservatives, but they are frequently a core facet of arguments about the morality of homosexual acts. What about Finis? One of the most intuitive approaches is to question his assertion that marriage is a fundamental good. While marriage as an institution may be beneficial, the rationale behind elevating it to a fundamental good on the level of life, knowledge, friendship, etc. is not immediately self-evident. But even if one were to grant that marriage is a fundamental good, critics may likewise argue that it is not self-evident that marriage is intrinsically an institution ordered towards procreation and emotional bonding. While marriage in some form or another has existed in virtually every culture, the structure of marriage has differed wildly across civilizations and over the millennia. Proponents of Finis' perspective would likely respond that, while it's true that marriage as an institution has manifested itself in many different forms across different cultures, the existence of diverse manifestations does not suggest that the nature of marriage is subjective, but rather that the objective nature of marriage has not always been fully realized everywhere that marriage exists. Critics, however, might point out that Finis appears to be begging the question, proposing assertions about the objective nature of marriage, without proving them to be more legitimate than alternative assertions. Arguments about the objective nature of marriage often rely upon religious arguments, such as the Christian assertion that God is the author of marriage. However, if natural law is meant to be intrinsically self-evident and immediately intelligible through reason alone, its premise can't rely upon divine revelation. While very few natural law proponents would argue that the assertions of divine revelation are fundamentally contrary to natural law, most natural law proponents would argue that something which requires knowledge of revelation to be binding on the conscience doesn't properly belong to the realm of natural law, but rather divine commandment. Finis' assertion then, while not necessarily untrue simply by virtue of the fact that it appears to take the assertions of divine revelation for granted, doesn't appear to be rooted in natural law alone, resulting in significant implications for how culpable an individual engaging in homosexual acts absent knowledge of said revelation could be. With that overview of natural law out of the way, what are the implications of natural law ethics for adopting gayness as an identity? Of course, as mentioned earlier, I am not going to push any specific conclusions about natural law on you, instead leaving you as the viewer to draw your own conclusions. Since, however, the goal of this video was to determine whether adopting a gay identity is necessarily troublesome for somebody subscribing to a traditional perspective on sexual ethics, let's momentarily, for the sake of argument, grant the position that homosexual acts are contrary to natural law. Granting this for the sake of argument, I want to emphasize, does not mean that I am asking you as viewers to either accept or reject this claim. Rather, I am merely attempting to explore the internal logical implications of the position. So, what can we conclude if we grant that homosexual acts are contrary to natural law? Furthermore, what can we conclude if we further assert, as most critics of gay identity do, that the metaphysical reality behind natural law implies that men and women are inherently complementary, such that human sexual nature is objectively ordered toward the pairing of men and women, while homosexual inclinations are a subjective deviation from that objective metaphysical reality? Do those two positions alone automatically mean that gayness as an identity is morally problematic? Not necessarily. To address that question, we must take one further philosophical step into the philosophy of identity, examining how objective and subjective components of identity come together to constitute the unique being we recognize as the self. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur offers a helpful distinction here between idem identity and ipse identity, between identity as sameness and identity as selfhood. On one level, we are the same kinds of beings across time, unchanged by subjective experience, biological, rational, sexed. But on another level, we are unique selves, persons with memory, intention, interiority, and narrative continuity. Identity, according to Ricoeur, is neither reducible purely to the objective and unchanging elements of our nature, nor is it purely free-floating or self-invented, as some existentialist philosophers might claim. Rather, our identity consists of a blend between objectivity and subjectivity, rooting our unique subjective experiences in the objective reality we inherit and share from other humans. In a similar vein, Edith Stein, a Catholic phenomenologist, emphasizes that the self is not a mere bundle of experiences or impulses, but a substantial unity between objective and subjective components. While subjective identity is not self-sufficient on its own, because it is dependent on objective truth and universal human nature, our very existence, after all, is contingent upon realities outside of ourselves. And while we as humans share the same universal capacities and inherent tendencies, embracing our subjective identity is essential because it reveals the unique dignity of each person, reflecting that we are not mere objects, but rather active subjects with an inner life and a capacity for self-formation. The subjective sense of self, which is important to affirm, is a combination of self-awareness, interiority, temporality, agency, and lived experience that we actively perceive, feel, think, and will. Karol Wojtyła, later Pope John Paul II, expanding upon these principles in his The Acting Person, argues that the human person is not a static thing who merely passively undergoes experiences and responds to stimuli, but rather is an active agent who shapes who he is by transferring the experiences of his unique inner life into external actions that give witness both to his subjective selfhood and, if properly ordered towards the flourishing of the individual, the objective reality his selfhood is grounded in. If, then, we acknowledge that both objective nature and subjective experience shape our unique identities, but we also affirm that expression of our subjective experience ought to be subject to objective nature, what does that mean for gay identity? First and foremost, we must determine whether the public acknowledgement of one's same-sex attractions constitutes, in itself, an outward rejection of objective nature or natural law. While critics of gay identity will argue that it does constitute a rejection of nature by virtue of the fact that it causes one to build their identity upon a subjective deviation from objective nature, those defending gay identity may point out that public acknowledgement of same-sex attraction can be an act of objective truthfulness, inasmuch as it represents an integration of subjective experience into a coherent and honest personal narrative about one's life. In other words, recognizing gay identity does not intrinsically place subjective experience over objective truth, but rather gives voice to a deeply influential part of one's lived experience in a way that can simultaneously affirm objective truth while testifying to the meaningfulness of that lived experience and shaping one's personal journey. While someone might make ontological claims about what goods they are ordered to in light of their homosexual orientation, and defenders of gay identity may even concede that this is a common occurrence, the mere act of identifying as gay nevertheless does not inherently make ontological claims about the human person, but rather recognizes the validity of what Ricoeur might call one's narrative selfhood. It would seem then that even if we affirm traditional positions on sexual ethics that encompass natural law and the metaphysics of human nature, there is still nothing fundamentally objectionable about identifying as gay. If one can express gay identity as an acknowledgement of both their subjective experience of same-sex attraction and the impact that attraction has on their life without inherently making objective ontological claims, then there is no reason to assert that gay identity is intrinsically ethically problematic. What, though, about an appeal to prudence? Is there an argument to be made that even if gay identity is not intrinsically unethical, it might be practically unwise given a person's circumstances or cultural environment? Prudence, understood in the classical sense, is the virtue by which we discern how best to apply universal moral principles to the complexity of particular situations. Opponents of gay identity may argue that since, in some communities, the label gay is so closely associated, at least in popular perception, with ontological assertions about human nature, using the label may lead to misunderstanding or scandal. They may also argue that identifying as gay could invite unnecessary emotional hardship, social marginalization, or uncharitable calumny that distracts from a peaceful life. While such objections aren't necessarily without merit, it's important to acknowledge that prudence involves weighing risk to benefit. With that in mind, are there any compelling reasons for same-sex attracted individuals to publicly identify as gay? Or, at the very least, to name and integrate their same-sex attraction and the queerness associated with it in language they're comfortable with? For many, choosing to identify as gay is an act of spiritual and psychological integration, a movement away from shame, repression, or fragmentation toward what Brené Brown describes as wholeheartedness, or the ability to live from a place of worthiness and courage by embracing vulnerability. In a previous video of mine distinguishing between authentic belonging and merely fitting in, I pointed out that authentic intimacy can only be achieved when one embraces a state of intentional vulnerability. Such intimacy, according to Brown, requires being genuinely known in the parts of ourselves we are most afraid to reveal. Beyond facilitating intimacy, though, vulnerability also offers relational clarity, making it easier to set healthy boundaries, explain personal history, avoid the confusion or pain that can come from being misread, and to resist pressure or pursue goals that would ultimately be unhelpful. Especially for gay individuals, the need for relational clarity is compelling. It can be painful to have to constantly dodge questions from family and friends, or even outright lie to avoid explaining why one isn't actively seeking out dates from the opposite sex, for example. Perhaps most compelling, though, is the idea that identifying as gay can be an act of moral responsibility toward others. As I mentioned in my video on being a role model, anyone who acts within the public sphere has, simply by virtue of being visible to those who learn from our example, a degree of ethical responsibility to model honesty, courage, and virtue in the face of difficulty. For those in my audience I acknowledged at the start of this video who are gay, but also striving to live in accordance with traditional religious principles, this visibility takes on particular significance, especially given the unique pressures they face from both secular and religious communities. Aaron Taylor, a postgraduate student of ethics addressing the phenomenon of same-sex attracted people of faith, argues that openly acknowledging one's orientation while remaining committed to one's values can serve as a powerful witness to those who share the same beliefs, offering a living example to those who might otherwise feel isolated or invisible. It can be profoundly alienating to lack role models who share both your experiences and convictions. Conversely, it can be deeply encouraging to see someone living that tension with integrity and hope. In this way, public identification can become a form of self-gift, an offering of solidarity and encouragement to others who may be walking a similar path. For those who do choose to hold to traditional ethics, then, identifying as gay may not only be morally permissible, but morally formative. What about social prudence? Some conservatives may argue that, even if there is individual benefit to be derived from identifying as gay, it's ultimately still imprudent because elevating struggles associated with queerness to public attention may risk shifting social mores and result in a misplaced empathy that challenges people's ethical convictions. But such a view, while framed as an appeal to prudence, ultimately fails to reckon with the deeper moral demands placed on us by charity and justice. As I argued in my video Civility Matters, any pursuit of the common good must not come at the cost of individual dignity, as no conception of common good can be coherent if it isn't consistent with the value of the units which comprise it. If society's vision of the good requires sidelining, silencing, or shaming the vulnerable, it cannot rightly be called good in any moral sense. The concern about misplaced empathy rests upon the assumption that empathy weakens our moral resolve. But authentic empathy does not require us to abandon conviction. It requires us to see the person before us in the full depth of their humanity. It is only through empathy that moral principles are properly humanized, grounded in concrete concern for the well-being of others. Empathy, then, is the disposition that makes truth livable. It does not ask us to agree with everyone, but it does demand that we see each person as someone whose life matters, whose dignity is not contingent upon our approval, and whose presence cannot be treated as a liability to be managed. If society is to remain morally intelligible at all, we must hold fast to the conviction that no person, regardless of sexual orientation, is ever a threat to the common good simply by virtue of being publicly known and loved. So, with that in mind, what should you, the viewer, do if you are gay but living in the closet? First and foremost, know this: you are not alone. You are not a problem to be solved or a liability to be managed. You are a human being with inherent worth, and this channel is a place where that truth is honored. You are safe here. You are seen. You are welcome. Whether you are wrestling with questions of faith, navigating conflicting cultural messages, or simply trying to find the language to make sense of your own story, I want to remind you, your life matters. Your story matters. If and when you feel ready to come out of the closet, that decision can be an act of integrity. Not because you owe anyone a disclosure, but because you deserve the freedom to be known. You deserve the space to live without shame and to build relationships with friends and family that are rooted in honesty rather than fear. This video is not here to tell you who you are or what path you should walk. It is here to affirm that you are capable of living a life marked by truth, courage, and dignity. And if you are a gay individual who holds to traditional religious convictions, please hear this clearly. Your presence in this conversation is vital and valued. You are not an outlier. You are not an embarrassment. You are not forgotten. My hope is that this video gives you the language, encouragement, and sense of belonging that maybe you haven't felt in a long time. And if it does, if even for a moment it helps you feel seen, then maybe, just maybe, it can be a voice that cuts through the sea of noise that too often drowns out voices like yours, bringing your existence to light for the world so that others might finally see you, and so that you'll never forget that your story is worth telling too. What do you think? Is it okay to identify as gay? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when new videos are released. Also be sure to like this video so that YouTube recommends it to others. If you would like to support this channel for as little as $1 a month, you can also become a supporter on Patreon. Links in the description of this video. Coming out is not a moral obligation, but neither is staying silent a moral virtue. While it may not be easy to discern what honesty and wholeness require of you, my sincere hope for you is that wherever you are in that discernment, you remember that your dignity is not up for debate. You already have it, and you always did. Peace be with you. This has been The Philosopher.